Colonel North, please rise. Do you solemnly swear that in the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. I had the approval of my superiors.
He's ollie this and he's ollie that. Get him out of here, the brute. But he's the savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot.
My memory has been shredded. If you would be so kind as to repeat the question.
Are you here telling the committee that you don't remember whether on November 21st there was a document in your files reflecting presidential approval?
That is a bald-faced lie told to the Iranians. And I will tell you right now, I'd have offered the Iranians a free trip to Disneyland if we could have gotten Americans home for it. I don't think there is another person in America that wants to tell this story as much as I do, sir.
Thank you, sir.
I came here to tell you the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I am here to tell it all, pleasant and unpleasant. And I am here to accept responsibility for that which I did. I will not accept responsibility for that which I did not do.
Weren't you going through your files to get rid of embarrassing documents?
Embarrassing? No. Documents that would compromise the national security of the United States, documents that would put lives at risk, documents that would demonstrate a covert action in the U.S. direction and control and relationship to it? Yes. Embarrassing? No. I'm not embarrassed to be here, counsel. The reason I destroyed documents.
That was not the question, sir.
I want to answer that.
That is not the question on the table.
But that's important.
The question on
counsel.
the table is different. Are there any documents, or were there in your files, that you were thinking about shredding on November the 21st that would have been any more damaging politically than one of these diversion memos reflecting presidential approval? That's the question.
The way you have asked the question, I can tell you absolutely not, because I don't think the documents existed on November 21st.
But according to Time last week, it said that someone who was associated with you, on one occasion you held up a copy of the Boland law and said, this is the law I'm violating and I could go to jail. And I think from your testimony yesterday, the day before, you said that's false.
It's hogwash, sir.
My question is simple. Did you tell the Iranians with whom you were negotiating on October 8th and 9th that the Secretary of Defense had told the President at his most recent meeting, when the American people find out that this has happened, they'll impeach you?
Mr. Niels, this is apparently one of the transcripts of tape recordings that I caused to be made of my discussions with the Iranians. I would like to note that for every conversation, whenever it was possible, I asked for the assistance of our intelligence services to tape record and transcribe every single session so that when I returned, there would be no doubt as to what I said. I am the one who created these tapes, plus the 7 hours of tape recordings that your committee found yesterday, because I knew where they were and I kept trying to alert you to them. And I am the one who created those tapes, so there would never be any doubt in the minds of my superiors as to what I had said or why I had said it. That is a bald-faced lie told to the Iranians. And I will tell you right now, I'd have offered the Iranians a free trip to Disneyland if we could have gotten Americans home for it. What I am saying, and I will repeat it again, I did not engage in this to make anybody, not myself, not General Secord, not Mr. Hakim or any of their other people, rich in the process. No one.
The problem is here, they were getting rich.
Do you have any final statement to make, sir?
A very brief one, sir.
Please proceed.
I would simply like to thank the American people who have responded with their good wishes their support, their prayers through what has been for me and my family a long and difficult ordeal. I thank them for that, and I salute them. Senator, without going overboard on the statement, I don't think that there's anyone else in the United States of America that worked as hard as I did to ensure A, a democratic outcome, and B, the survival of the Nicaraguan resistance from 1984 to 1986.
Colonel, there is no question about it.
People used to walk up to me and tell me what a great job I was doing. And the fact is, there were many, many people, to include the former Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, the current National Security Advisor, the Attorney General of the United States of America, the Director of Central Intelligence, all of whom knew that to be wrong. Counsel, I think I've answered the question as best I can. I'm not too sure who you want to blame for committing who. If you want to blame me for committing others, that's fine.
Now, you were involved in providing the bank account number to Elliot Abrams for the Brunei solicitation, right?
I was.
The fact that the number was transposed was just an error that you never noticed.
Had I noticed it, it wouldn't have been transposed.
Now,
well, again, Counsel, I have not seen that card. I would point out that my secretary, and as I indicated yesterday, I believe, was not only given the gift of beauty by the good Lord, but she had brains. And I think that the committee had the chance to see that. She made very few errors. And I don't know that she made the error on that card or someone else did. Or that was precisely the card that was carried to give to the representatives of the Brunei government.
You indicated that the Iranians at that time were very distrustful of about everybody. I think you characterized them as being unsophisticated. They were angry at being scammed, I think is your word, by the Israelis back in November of '85. They were sort of on the ragged edge of rationality. They could kill the hostages at any time just by giving the word to their Lebanese captors. But in spite of this, we agreed to a program whereby we inflated the cost of those munitions 300% or 400%, and then we're going to use that residual margin for the Contras and other special programs. And the Iranians found out at some point that they were being gouged, and they complained rather bitterly about it, and then we were left with the only alternative of coming up with some phony price lists rather than try to reduce the price. And it occurs to me that didn't this run the very risk at the time when the Iranians were so sensitive about being gouged and taken advantage of and lied to by a host of people, at that very time that we would risk the lives of the hostages that you were very passionately concerned about, as evident from the record, by combining these two covert programs in that fashion?
It did, and we discussed that at length, Director Casey and I recall at least one occasion where the Admiral and I discussed it. The fact is that we knew that the Iranians would pay even more than we were charging from intelligence that we had gathered. We knew that during the first channel, for example, that Mr. Ghorbani Farr had a little frolic and diversion of his own going on, in which he had pocketed at least some for himself, if not for others, a considerable sum, and that even the prices we charged, he further inflated. And so we had judged that risk to be minimum, given that they would basically pay whatever they could to get these items or weapons from the source, whatever source they could.
And what you're saying is that even after that, which occurred before lunch, you were there taking batches of documents past these attorneys from the Department of Justice and shredding them, and they weren't saying, stop, we'd like to look, what are you doing, we're concerned? None of that, right?
I'm not trying to leave the wrong impression, counsel. Okay, what I'm saying to you is I thought, and perhaps they thought, and I'm trying to be in several people's mind at once, is that they were looking for the facts on what had transpired in September and October, November of 1985. All right? And what I was told they were looking for, I thought was in the files that I gave them. Let me finish. I was also engaged in a number of other projects of national security importance. The fact that I was shredding documents, I don't think would be unusual to them. This was, after all, an office with a shredder in it. I mean, I'm not trying to say that these guys were just letting me willy-nilly go and shred documents. I had a shredder for that purpose. If I'd finished reading a top-secret cable of intelligence value, you don't leave those things sitting around your office. You destroy them after you read them. And that's what I was doing.
Colonel, were you taking single documents over to the shredder, or were you taking files over to the shredder?
I was not taking files. I would go through a file. I was sitting at my desk. They were working 10 feet from me. And we would go, they were working on their projects. I was working on mine.
Yes. I want to hear more about it. Go ahead.
Well,
I'm not interrupting.
I don't think you ought to accuse them of incompetence because they stopped a guy from doing his job. That's why the government of the United States gave me a shredder.
But your job on that day was to get rid of files, wasn't it? That's what you came in for.
No, that isn't what I came in for. I was working desperately, among other things, and I received 2 or 3 phone calls on it to keep the hostages alive. Good grief, we'd had this stuff all over the newspapers. The Israelis were calling me every half hour, and I was working with those people. They heard me taking the phone calls.
Colonel,
I was also in the process of looking after several other action packages that I had to move across the street on totally unrelated issues.
Colonel, was your work on the phone with the Israelis leading you to shred documents?
Objection.
On occasion.
Well, you can't land 120 or let's say 80 Hawk missiles in a jumbo jet, unload it, store it, and then put it back on 3 small planes at an airport without people there knowing that you're transporting something other than oil drilling equipment, can you?
Well, it depends on what they're packed in, but I mean, what you just hit on is one of the reasons why we were so concerned with this whole operation to begin with.
Well, what I'm asking is...
There were major problems operationally in this thing right from the start. And what bothered me most of all, and I think I communicated that fairly clearly to my superiors, is here, fix it. And the thing is already on fire when they throw the bag to you, and you know what's in the bag. It's a serious problem.
Is it also so that for some months you had been telling friends like Mr. Owen that you were going to be the fall guy?
I may well have, as I believe I have already testified. I may well have told Mr. Owen and perhaps others that if this whole thing came down to creating a political controversy or embarrassment, that I would be the person who would be dismissed or reassigned or fired or blamed or fingered or whatever one wants to use as a description.
Did you ask him, Admiral Poindexter, why did you not discuss this with the President?
No.
Why not?
First of all, I'm not in the habit of questioning my superiors. If he deemed it not to be necessary to ask the President, I saluted smartly and charged up the hill. That's what lieutenant colonels are supposed to do. I have no problem with that. I don't believe that what we did, even under those circumstances, is wrong or illegal.
And
I've told you I thought it was a good idea to begin with. I still think it was a good idea, Counsel.
And have you wondered why, if it was a good idea, that the President of the United States dismissed you because of it?
Let me just make one thing very clear, Counsel. This lieutenant colonel is not going to challenge a decision of the commander-in-chief for whom I still work. And I am proud to work for that commander-in-chief. And if the commander-in-chief tells this lieutenant colonel to go stand in the corner and sit on his head, I will do so. And if the commander-in-chief decides to dismiss me from the NSC staff, this lieutenant colonel will proudly salute and say thank you for the opportunity to have served and go. And I am not going to criticize his decision, no matter how he relieves me, sir.
Has anyone given you an explanation, Colonel North, on behalf of the President, of why he did not think it was a good idea and dismissed you?
The President of the United States saw fit to call me later the same day. And in the course of that call, which was also intensely personal, he told me words to the effect, "I just didn't know."
Admiral Poindexter was specifically asking you to send memoranda up for the President's approval.
Well, again, in this particular case, that's true, Mr. Niels, and I don't believe that I have said that Admiral Poindexter told me to stop. Did I?
Where are these memoranda?
Which memoranda?
The memoranda that you sent up to Admiral Poindexter seeking the President's approval.
Well, they're probably in these books to my left that I haven't even looked through yet, and I'm going to, if I try to guess, I'm going to be wrong. But I think I shredded most of that. Did I get them all? I'm not trying to be flippant. I'm just...
Well, that was going to be my very next question, Colonel North. Isn't it true that you shredded them?
I believe I did.
Once the documents were destroyed, you were out there without any kind of assurance that anyone would stand behind you. Is that fair to say?
That was the plan. I mean, it was planned that I would be out there. I mean, and everything had gone right according to plan right up until about 12:05 in the afternoon the next day, or several days thereafter.
And when the plan changed was when you had the IC, or the criminal investigation, announced.
Well, I don't know where, in who else's mind, the plan changed, Counsel. I know that when I heard the words criminal investigation or criminal behavior, or whatever the words were that were used in the press conference, or shortly thereafter, it was certainly profound at that point, that my mindset changed considerably. And there was probably not another person on the planet Earth as shocked as I was to hear that someone thought it was criminal. And I can tell you that that shock was compounded when I heard later that there was to be an independent counsel, and further compounded when I was the only name in the appointment order for that independent counsel. The only person on the planet Earth named in that appointment order, Counsel. I think every single penny that's left ought to go to the Nicaraguan resistance.
Well,
and save the taxpayers a couple of dollars.
We asked Mr. Hakim about that, who has control over it, and he would not agree to that.
Give me 10 minutes with Mr. Hakim.
You think if you have 10 minutes that you can get Mr. Hakim to turn over that $8 million?
If I could meet with anybody without a bunch of lawyers around, I reckon I could, sir.
I admire Lieutenant Colonel North for his professional integrity and beliefs, his personal commitment to this country, and his ability to be a friend when one is needed. I'd like to take the time to reflect a little bit on Colonel North's, what I was very touched by one time. We were working in the office, and we were working on a crisis, and a gentleman walked in the office and delivered us a copy of the National Bipartisan Commission report and explained that an American citizen, an electrician, had found it in a hotel and had seen the presidential seal and thought it to be in a very important document that he should get back to the White House. And it made its way up from the sit room, I believe, to Colonel North because it had to do with Central America. Colonel North at this time said he was very touched by the fact that someone had taken the time to return what he thought was an important document, and he was touched by it also, and said, I think we should try to see if we can't get the president to write this man a letter and thank him. And I think that reflects a little bit on Colonel North's sensitivity. I think it's important.
I suppose that what has been most disturbing to me about your testimony is the ugly part. In fact, it has been more than ugly. It has been chilling and, in fact, frightening. I'm not talking just about your part in this, but the entire scenario about government officials who plotted and conspired, who set up a straw man, a fall guy, officials who lied, misrepresented, and deceived, officials who planned to superimpose upon our government a layer outside of our government, shrouded in secrecy and only accountable to the conspirators. I could go on, but we both know the testimony, and it is ugly. In my opinion, it is a prescription for anarchy in a democratic society.
Don't tell him what it includes.
Well, I think that if a witness is looking at something, that I, as counsel, am entitled to see what he's refreshing his recollection on.
I think you're wrong. That's a product of lawyers working with clients.
And you think that a witness is entitled to read something and that we're not entitled to see what he's reading?
He's entitled to use his notes and to preserve the attorney-client privilege. Everything in that book is a product of the attorney-client and work product privilege. Mr. Lyman, and you know that.
Are you able to recall your conversation with Admiral Poindexter on the 21st about the diversion without looking at that book?
That's none of your business either. You just ask him the question.
Please address the chair.
Mr. Chairman, let's get to the substance of these hearings and stop trying to get off his back.
I've never for a moment, over the years that I have known you, doubted your good intentions. To free hostages, to seek democracy in Nicaragua, to fight communism, and to advance the best interests of the nation. Despite your very good intentions, you were a participant in actions which catapulted a president into the most serious crisis of his presidency, drove the Congress of the United States to launch an unprecedented investigation, and I think probably damaged the cause or the causes that you sought to promote. It is not my task, and it is not the task of these committees to judge you.
I don't know whether you're going to go down in history as a hero or not. I don't know what the fate of all of the discussions we're having here will be. I know there were some mistakes made you've admitted to. There are some things I'm sure you and I would disagree about with regard to some of the policies, though many of them I agree more with you than some of my colleagues do. I do know that Douglas MacArthur was and is to this day considered a hero, and yet he was fired by President Truman. So I would say that you don't have to be perfect to be a hero. And one thing is for certain, Colonel Oliver North, you've served your country admirably. You have been a dedicated, patriotic soldier, and there's no question you've gone above and beyond on many occasions the call of duty.
What concerns me from your testimony, and I'm not saying it's your policy,
I'm willing to take responsibility, sir.
You're simply following orders.
I don't think that's an excuse for doing something against the law.
Well, let me make this statement and ask you if it's correct. Not a single official elected by the people of the United States of America had any knowledge about the use of that fund. Is that correct?
From the beginning of the history of mankind, organized societies, whether they be tribes or clans or nations, have nurtured and created heroes. Because heroes are necessary. They serve as a cement to unite people, to bring unity in that nation. It provides glory to their history. It provides legends. We have many heroes. I believe during the past week, we have participated in creating and developing, very likely, a new American hero. Like you, who as one has felt the burning sting of bullet and shrapnel and heard the unforgettable and frightening sounds of incoming shells, I salute you, sir, as a fellow combat man. And the rows of ribbons that you have on your chest will forever remind us of your courageous service and your willingness, your patriotic willingness to risk your life and your limb. I'm certain the life and burdens of a hero will be difficult and heavy. And so with all sincerity, I wish you well as you begin your journey into a new life.
And one question the American people would like to know the answer to is, what did the President know about the diversion of the proceeds of Iranian arms sales to the Contras? Can you tell us what you know about that, sir?
We just took a long leap from Mr. Hassenfuss's airplane. As I told this committee several days ago, and if you will indulge me, counsel, in a brief summary of what I said, I never personally discussed the use of the residuals or profits from the sale of U.S. weapons to Iran for the purpose of supporting the Nicaraguan resistance with the President. I never raised it with him, and he never raised it with me during my entire tenure at the National Security Council staff. Throughout the conduct of my entire tenure at the National Security Council, I assumed that the President was aware of what I was doing and had, through my superiors, approved it. I sought approval of my superiors for every one of my actions, and it is well documented. I assumed, when I had approval to proceed from either Judge Clark, Bud McFarlane, or Admiral Poindexter, that they had indeed solicited and obtained the approval of the President. To my recollection, Admiral Poindexter never told me that he met with the President on the issue of using residuals from the Iranian sales to support the Nicaraguan resistance, or that he discussed the residuals or profits for use by the Contras with the President, or that he got the President's specific approval. Nor did he tell me that the President had approved such a transaction. But again, I wish to reiterate that throughout, I believe that the President had indeed authorized such activity. No other person with whom I was in contact with during my tenure at the White House told me that he or she ever discussed the issue of the residuals or profits with the President. In late November, two other things occurred which relate to this issue. On or about Friday, November 21st, I asked Admiral Poindexter directly, does the President know? He told me he did not. And on November 25th, the day I was reassigned back to the United States Marine Corps for service, the President of the United States called me. In the course of that call, the President said to me, words to the effect that, I just didn't know. I happen to believe that this nation needs to be able to conduct deniable covert operations. I believe that this President, like all presidents, needs to have an ability to dissociate himself from those activities, and that the U.S. role should remain hidden or deniable and not be revealed. And that is, after all, the essence of those operations. Part of a covert operation is to offer plausible deniability of the association of the government of the United States with the activity. Part of it is to deceive our adversaries. Part of it is to ensure that those people who are at great peril carrying out those activities are not further endangered. All of those are good and sufficient reasons to destroy documents. And that's why the government buys shredders by the tens and dozens and gives them to people running covert operations, not so that they can have convenient memories. I came here to tell you the truth, to tell you in this committee and the American people the truth, and I'm trying to do that, Mr. Niels, and I don't like the insinuation that I'm up here having a convenient memory lapse like perhaps some others have had. And so we told them, don't worry, we won't divulge it. I was sent there and I told them that on instruction. Now my answer toward protecting individuals and protecting the role of foreign governments and protecting the nature of the support to the Nicaraguan resistance. I mean, after all, if we had announced in the newspapers, Counsel, that we were building an airfield in a Central American country to support the Nicaraguan resistance and told the American people, and unfortunately had we told the Congress, it would have become public and the Sandinistas would have known about it.
Well, sir, you have already testified that Izvestia had written about it.
Izvestia didn't write about
newspapers had written about it. Our newspapers were writing about it.
But they weren't writing about it in specific detail.
Are you saying the Sandinistas did not know about the resupply operation?
I'm telling you, Sandinistas didn't know what time of day and night that the airplanes were taking off.
Did Congress inquire what time of day or night the airplanes were taking off?
No, but that's what
They asked whether you were engaged in supporting the Contras during the pendency of a law that prohibited it.
Counsel?
That prohibited...
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, there were two interruptions there, and I know that lawyers can sometimes get excited and fire rapid questions, but I'm asking that we be particularly sensitive to permitting the witness to finish the answer.
That matter has been brought to my attention. Counsel, proceed.
You denied Congress the facts.
You
did. Denied the elected representatives of our people the facts upon which they needed to make a very important decision for this nation.
I did because of what I have just described to you as our concerns. And I did it because we have had incredible leaks from discussions with closed committees of the Congress. I was a part of, as people now know, the coordination for the mining of the harbors in Nicaragua. When that one leaked, there were American lives at stake. And it leaked from a member of one of the committees who eventually admitted it. When there was a leak on the sensitive intelligence methods that we used to help capture the Achille Lauro terrorists, it almost wiped out that whole channel of communications. I mean, those kinds of things are devastating. They are devastating to the national security of the United States. And I desperately hope that one of the things that can derive from all of this ordeal is that we can find a better way by which we can communicate those things properly with the Congress.
Our emphasis on a political rather than a military solution to the situation was as close as we ever came to influencing the military aspect of their struggle. Is that statement true, sir?
Well, it is partially true. I'm not saying that all of the rest of it's true. What I am saying to you is that I continue to believe, as I did then, that there will ultimately have to be a political solution. War is, after all, a political endeavor. And I do not believe that we're going to see a victory march down the streets of Managua. What I do believe that we can achieve is a democratic outcome in Nicaragua as part of a political process. Starting in the spring of 1984, well before the Boland proscription of no appropriated funds made available to the DOD or the CIA, etc., I was already engaged in supporting the Nicaraguan resistance. and a democratic outcome in Nicaragua. I did so as a part of a covert operation that was carried out starting as early as the spring of '84, when we ran out of money and people started to look in Nicaragua and in Honduras and Guatemala, El Salvador and Costa Rica for some sign of what the Americans were really going to do. And that help began much earlier than the most rigorous of the Boland proscriptions. And yes, it was carried out covertly, and it was carried out in such a way as to ensure that the heads of state and the political leadership in Nicaragua, in Central America, recognized that the United States was going to meet the commitments of the president's foreign policy. And the president's foreign policy was that we are going to achieve a democratic outcome in Nicaragua, and that our support for the Nicaraguan freedom fighters was going to continue, and that I was given the job of holding them together in body and soul. And it slowly transitioned into a more difficult task as time went on, and as the CIA had to withdraw further and further from that support, until finally we got to the point in October when I was the only person left talking to them.
I take it one area of your support was to endeavor to raise money from sources other than the U.S. Treasury.
That's correct. Boland proscriptions did not allow us to do so. And so we sought a means of complying with those Boland proscriptions by going elsewhere for those monies.
And you went to foreign countries?
I did not physically go to those foreign countries.
Representatives of
foreign countries and I had discussions about those matters, yes.
And you asked them for money for the Contras?
Well, I want to be a little bit more specific about that. I don't recall going hat in hand to anybody asking for money. I do recall sitting and talking about how grateful this country would be if the issue that they had discussed with others were indeed brought to fruition.
Mr. McFarland has testified that he gave you instructions not to solicit money from foreign countries or private sources. Did he give you those instructions?
I never carried out a single act, not one, Mr. Niels, in which I did not have authority from my superiors. I haven't, in the 23 years that I have been in the uniformed services of the United States of America, ever violated an order, not one.
But that wasn't the question. The question was...
That is the answer to your question.
No, the question was, did Mr. McFarland give you such instructions?
No. I had already provided to Mr. McFarland a card with the address of an account, an offshore account which would support the Nicaraguan resistance. And thank God somebody put money into that account, and the Nicaraguan resistance didn't die, as perhaps others intended. Certainly the Sandinistas and Moscow and Cuba intended that, and they didn't die. I was the person who was causing these things to happen. There was no doubt in their mind. That's why when an airplane goes down in Honduras, they call me to get the bodies home and to pay the costs. That's why when somebody needs something done in the case of this contact right here, you've pointed out as part of exhibit number 79, they called me. These people knew what I was doing. They knew that it was a covert operation being conducted by this government to support the Nicaraguan resistance.
In addition to raising money from third countries, I take it you also raised some money from private individuals.
I want to be very clear about that. Not because of Boland, but because I understood that there were regulations against government officials soliciting. I do not recall ever asking a single solitary American citizen for money. I want to make that very clear. You may have found someone who said that I did, but I sure don't remember it, and I tried very, very hard to live with that proscription. Not because it was Boland, not because we perceived that the NSC was in any way obviated from doing what I was doing, but only because someone had told me that a U.S. government official should not, cannot, will not, whatever, solicit.
Well, you asked Joseph Coors for $65,000 for a Maul airplane,
Not
didn't
so.
you?
He offered the money, and I told him where to send it, and an airplane was bought with it, and it flies today in support of the Nicaraguan resistance unless the Sandinistas have shot it down.
Did you call him?
No. He arrived in my office one afternoon.
Would you describe that event?
Well, again, you're probably going to pull out a note of mine that's got something on it. And if you can, refresh me, but otherwise I'll go unrefreshed. As I had seen Mr. Coors a number of times, both before and since. It is my recollection that Mr. Coors arrived in my office one afternoon. I got a telephone call from Director Casey. Maybe I went down and met Mr. Coors in Mr. Casey's office, or maybe he walked into my office. I don't recall specifically. He offered to help, asked what he could do. I suggested various things, showed him an airplane that was desperately needed, a STOL airplane that would take off, short takeoff and land. And he said, "Good, how much is it?" Or words to that effect. I said, "There's the price list from the company." And Mr. Coors then made available that sum, and it was put in the account, and an airplane was bought with it. But I didn't ask him for that money. He offered it.
This afternoon, I'd like to ask you what actually did happen. And perhaps we could take first the August-September shipment of tows. And I think it might be most helpful if you simply would describe for the committee what your understanding and role was in that transaction at the time it happened. Would you do so, please, sir?
The August-September '85 shipment is the one I believe you're referring to, sir?
Correct.
I'm working without refreshed recall. Let me do the best I can to remember back to that period of time. I had had several meetings with Mr. Ledeen, which led to a meeting or two with 2 Israeli citizens, private citizens, and then a subsequent meeting, as I recall, with Mr. Ghorbanifar. That in turn led to a meeting with Mr. Kimke, and I believe all of these took place prior to the September shipment. Mr. Kimke and Mr. McFarland then had a meeting, as I recall, and I was aware, I think by virtue of the sensitive intelligence, at the time that the Israelis were indeed involved in a transaction. I did not know at the time the exact nature of that, I don't think, but I did know that as a consequence, an American hostage or 2 was expected to be released. I was instructed to take precautions for that eventuality. We did so. Reverend Weir was picked up in accord with what we expected to happen, delivered to a U.S. vessel, and then shortly thereafter brought to a U.S. military installation here in the United States. I met him and brought with me a letter from the President asking his assistance as best he could give it and expressing the President's well wishes on his release from captivity. I don't have a specific recall of many things happening in between, although I believe I had another meeting with Mr. Ghorbanifar. My next very specific recollection are the series of phone calls I described to you on or about the 17th of November.
I'd like to stop you and ask you some questions about the tow transaction, if I may first. Yes. Who are the two Israeli citizens?
Mr. Schwimmer and Mr. Nimrati.
Were the meetings that you described with Mr. Ledeen, Mr. Schwimmer, Mr. Nimrati, and Mr. Ghorbanifar meetings in which arms were discussed?
I believe they were, yes.
And hostages?
Oh, yes, but also discussed were the broader purposes for an opening with Iran, the opportunity to end Shia fundamentalist terrorism.
What was your authority for participating in those meetings?
Well, Mr. McFarland's authority as an NSC staffer.
So that Mr. McFarland was aware of the fact that you were having these meetings and he had authorized them?
Well, I did keep Mr. McFarland apprised of those, yes I did. Normally through the prof system, I think.
Was it your understanding that Mr. McFarland had already had similar meetings himself with either the two Israeli citizens, Mr. Ghorbanifar or Mr. Kimki?
I came to the understanding, and I'm not sure exactly when it was, that Mr. McFarland and Mr. Kimki had met several times, and further that there had been, by the time, I guess, October or November got around, that there had actually been discussions of this with the President. I was not a party to any of those discussions with the President, but I was told at some point that the President had authorized these Israeli transactions to proceed during the summer in July. At some point in December, while I was overseas, there were meetings held at the White House among a number of cabinet officers in which apparently these issues were discussed. And subsequent to that, there was a finding done giving retroactive ratification to what had already transpired that cabinet officers were also aware of. The proposal as it was being advanced to me was that this is in our interest to achieve a strategic breakthrough with Iran, to establish contacts with moderate or pragmatic elements within Iran. And I happen to believe that. I think it was in our interest. I think it still is in our interest that if we have a means of establishing some kind of a strategic relationship with this country, that it serves our interests. And so, as I recall, the discussion started out in a very philosophical vein, but quickly moved beyond that over the course of several weeks to discuss specific activities that would allow that breakthrough. My guess is, and I'm trying to put myself in someone else's shoes, what they wanted to do was to get our acknowledgement, acquiescence, concurrence in providing these materials that they otherwise could not legally or correctly move.
Would you simply pick up the story of the Hawk shipment, starting with that call that you received from the Israeli official, and tell us in your own words what you remember? And we know that this is a more complicated story than the tow shipment, and you can rely on me to ask you some questions after you've told your narrative.
All right, sir. It is my recollection that on November 17th, I received a phone call in the evening from an Israeli official who was in New York, indicating a problem. I then, I think, while I was still on the line with him, got a call from Mr. McFarland. My contemporaneous note at the time indicates that the two calls were, if nothing else, sequential.
I take it this was a call from Mr. Rabin.
It was.
And what was the problem?
Well, he did, at that point, he didn't go into it in any detail, that there was a problem with a shipment, a movement on the project that I knew about. I then got a call from Mr. McFarland from Europe telling me that Mr. Rabin would call. I told him I'd already talked to Mr. Rabin. He said, look, just, you go take care of that problem. This was a transatlantic open line telephone call, as I remember it. And so my recollection is I flew up immediately to talk with Mr. Rabin. He then sent several of his Ministry of Defense representatives to talk with me. It was in that period of time that I became aware of what was really trying to be moved. Now, I may have already known some of that from sensitive intelligence, but the full parameters of it were laid out for me by Mr. Rabin and his representatives. As I recall, the Director of Central Intelligence was out of town, and in my discussions which followed with the MOD representatives, they specified a replenishment problem. In addition to solving the immediate problem of getting the Hawks, the original number of which was to be 120, moved from Israel through a European country and then on to Iran, there was the problem of replenishing the tows which had been shipped in August, September. As I recall, I made a number of telephone calls to the Department of Defense, to my point of contact. I think it was at that point either Mr. Cook or General Powell, trying to ascertain the cost of a Hawk system, the cost of a tow system. There was a rather protracted period of time in which all of this was worked out. I also took, at that point in time, a decision with the approval of Admiral Poindexter and Mr. McFarland, and asked General Secord to fly to Europe to see what he could do to straighten out the mess.
I want you to explain once again how Secord and Hakeem were first brought into the picture.
My recollection, Congressman Jenkins, is that in the early days of 1984, when we saw the money running out, we had a number of discussions within the administration as to what the alternatives were. And the person who suggested General Secord to me, and I then took the name to Mr. McFarland, was Director Casey.
And did you at that time already know General Secord?
I had met General Secord in 1981, shortly after I arrived on the NSC staff. He was at that point, I believe, I don't want to get his title wrong, but I think his title was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. And I may have the title wrong.
Let me ask you about him. At that time, did you know that there had been some question at one time or another about a security clearance for General Secord?
No, I did not, sir.
At any rate, you made contact with him, and it was him that brought in Mr. Albert Hakeem.
Yes, sir. Again, I went to General Secord, as I recall, it might have been in the spring or summer of '84, basically seeking someone who can give the kind of advice and logistic support and the kinds of activity support to the resistance that we perceived they needed, because the CIA was, as I indicated, being pulled away.
I take it there was originally contemplated to ship more than 18 Hawks.
The original number as I remember, the original number I was told was 80, and then I was told later on that it was 120, and 120 sticks in my mind as being the number that was eventually determined that was intended to be shipped. And I think that we had some confirmation that that was the arrangement through sensitive intelligence.
And can you tell us the story of why only 18 were shipped?
It's a bit of a horror story. The original plan, as had been worked out by the Israelis, would have put, as I recall, either 40 or 80 on a 747 cargo jet, and that would offload in a European country, then reload onto other aircraft. General Secord said, that's not going to work. It's going to be too visible to people. Let's move the stuff out of Israel directly. He worked that out with the Israelis, and only 18 could be put into the kind of aircraft that was provided, because apparently the configuration of the door, I defer to experts on loading airplanes for exactly what the problem was, but it was, I think, a loading problem more than anything else that only allowed 18 to be loaded at once.
Well, that explains why only 18 went at one time, but why weren't the rest of them shipped later?
To coin a phrase, I think the Iranians went ballistic when they saw what they got. And the reason they did so is they had apparently been told by the Israelis that they were getting a system that would shoot down Soviet and Iraqi high-altitude aircraft. And the Hawk system is not a high-altitude weapon system. It is a low-altitude defensive weapon system. And apparently they felt that they had been misled. Now, having not been a party to whatever the Iranians were told, either by Mr. Ghorbanifar or Mr. Nimrati or Mr. Schwimmer, General Secord was obviously concerned that someone had misled the Iranians at the far end, and they were very upset. I mean, we could see that in sensitive intelligence. They apparently disassembled one of the 18 Hawks, noticed that it did not meet what they had. In fact, it was the same as what they already had in their inventory from the United States, and were very, very concerned. We became concerned at that point, or at least I did, that because of the commitments that had been made for something other than what was delivered, that we were indeed, instead of rescuing hostages, creating a situation in which they were being placed at increasing risk because of potential reprisals or something like that. And at that point in time, a proposal was developed by which we would take these activities and exert more control over them and management over them. In that you just couldn't have people making commitments for American lives in faraway places and creating a situation where those who were supposedly helping to influence their release would think we were being just cheating on them, is the word that was used frequently in the sensitive intelligence.
Colonel, did there come a time when the pricing of the arms to Iran, which were yielding the profits, began to cause a problem?
I'm not quite certain, counsel, whether it was the pricing or simply the person we were arranging it through, but there was some difficulty with that, yes.
In fact, did there come a time when you were advised that Mr. Ghorbanifar was saying that the Iranian government had concluded that it had been substantially overcharged?
Yes, that's correct.
And he reported that the Iranian government had gotten hold of some microfiche of Defense Department prices?
In fact, to be more explicit, the Iranian government was apparently still on the mailing list for those microfiches.
And he said that looking at those microfiches and what Ghorbanifar had charged them, there was a 600% markup or something like that.
I'm not sure of the percentage that he alluded to, but he did indicate that they had been overcharged.
And when you first got deeply involved in December and January, one of the problems you had encountered then was that the Iranians were claiming that they had been cheated by Nimrati et al., right?
The cheating in that case was the delivery of a system that did not fulfill their expectations and what they had been told that it would do.
And now
it was not, as I understood it, an issue of price, but more of capability.
And now you were faced with accusations from the first channel that they were being cheated by our pricing. right?
That was what he told us, but it turns out that it was not so much an internal Iranian problem, I don't think, so much as it was his personal problem.
Did you discuss with Mr. Casey that you had to find some way of dealing with the claims of the first channel and their financiers? Is that fair to say?
Yes, although I must tell you that there were many who advocated, not many, but some who, there weren't many who knew about this, but within the group of people who knew about it, there were some of us who advocated letting Mr. Ghorbanifar deal with it himself. It was a problem that he had created. I would point out that although we had certainly run the charges up, Mr. Ghorbanifar had almost doubled it on top of that. And so many of the problems that were created were of his own design.
Is it a fact that the problem that you were concerned about was his threat or the threat of his financiers to make this public?
Well, yes, absolutely.
And so an operation that had been kept quiet from Congress was now in danger of being blown by people who said they hadn't been paid.
Well, again, I don't want to leave anyone with a misapprehension that it was simply a matter of keeping it secret from Congress. As I have testified for nearly 4 days, this was an operation that was to be kept secret across the board. And it wasn't simply a matter of keeping it from the Congress.
When you say...
It was a covert operation for all of the reasons that I have described the needs for secrecy and covert operation.
Well, when you say secret across the board, would you agree with me that at the very least the following people knew about our involvement? One, Mr. Ghorbanifar.
Certainly, he started it.
The Israelis.
Some in the Israeli government.
The Iranian government officials in the first channel.
Yes.
The Iranian government officials in the second channel.
That's correct.
So that you were willing, now when I say you, I'm not talking just about you,
those
obviously.
Of us engaged in the activity, I understand.
Yes, those who were engaged in the activity were willing to take the risk on trusting them with secrecy, but concluded that it was not possible or prudent to reveal it to the leadership of Congress. That's what it comes down to?
Counsel, you're asking me to second-guess the decision not to have advised the Congress in the initiation of this activity on the finding of 6 or 17 January, and I'm not going to second-guess that decision. I would point out that in the previous administration, just prior to this one, there was a similar effort to rescue hostages, and to my knowledge, the Congress was not briefed on that one. And there were Iranians and Israelis and foreign government officials and officials throughout our government who were apprised of that activity, and because of the risk to life of American citizens, to include the hostages, the Congress was not briefed.
Were you involved in the decision to seek the second channel?
Yes.
And you got approval on that from Admiral Poindexter?
I did.
And you were involved in the various negotiations with that channel?
I'm not sure how many there were before I got involved, but the initial contact was made, I think, by General Secord in a European country. He evaluated it, reported back, and if my recollection serves me right, we then had a meeting here in the United States.
And you understood that Mr. Hakim was the person who helped locate that channel?
Yes.
And did Hakim tell you that a $2 million reserve had been set aside in order to make payoffs for the second channel?
Well, as we discussed last night, and I think even during the day yesterday, Mr. Hakim made it clear that there was a necessity to compensate those engaged in the activity. I did not press the issue. I know well the meaning of the term bakshish, and I know it is a long-established tradition in that part of the world. I do not recall discussing a specific amount, but it was very clear to me that that was part of the activity.
When you were present at the negotiations, who headed the American negotiating team?
Are we talking first or second channel?
Second.
I guess I did.
Now, did you present to the second channel the so-called 7-point plan?
I guess if that's what you're calling it, I suppose I wrote down 7 or 6 or 8 or whatever number of points on a piece of paper. I didn't refer to it at the time, I don't think, as the 7-point plan.
Can you look at Exhibit 308? Is that your writing on the...
That is my writing.
And it's headed United States Proposal?
That's what it says.
Now, is that a proposal that you presented to the second channel?
I'm sure it was. I don't recall whether this was done at the meeting in Washington or the meeting in Europe, but I'm sure that that is one of many proposals, all of which I had tape recorded by the Central Intelligence Agency or by myself with Central Intelligence Agency equipment, so that there would never, ever be any doubt as to what I was saying or obligating or committing to.
Now, Colonel, before you made your proposals to them, did you get authority from anyone as to what you would, as you just said, commit to or present to them?
In general terms, yes. And as you can see, one of them were all American hostages released right up at the top.
Do you recall having a discussion on this subject in Germany?
As I said, I thought maybe this is what I presented in either one of the meetings in the United States, in Germany, in Geneva, Paris,
I think this has been
other places that we met.
This has been identified and was produced by Mr. Hakim as being presented in Germany.
Was there a date on this? And I could check my travel schedule, but
There wasn't. You may have a different
I don't think that the location is all that important.
Did you also talk about the fact that there were 2 million homeless people in Iran?
Which also happens to be a fact.
And did you talk about the fact that the United States would supply aid, like a Marshall Plan, for them?
I talked about the fact that they ought to get beyond the issue of trading a few weapons for a few live bodies, and that what our initiative was all about was a reopening with Iran, and that the President of the United States shared those concerns. The fact that I exaggerated my connection with the President of the United States in order to further this initiative, I have already admitted to. The fact is, we in this country have always expressed concern for those kinds of matters. And the fact is, if we could have gotten beyond where we were and established a relationship with Iran, I am confident that we would be doing something for the millions of homeless in Iran and the hundreds of partial paraplegics and those who need prosthetic limbs on both sides of that war.
Did you say words to that effect that you've just expressed with this
Yes,
conviction
and they
here?
are on the tape.
Now, Colonel, you have talked about the fact that you found yourself very much involved in the management of a covert operation. Did you now find yourself very much involved in a diplomatic assignment?
My whole purpose, as is also on the tape, and is also in the memoranda that I sent forward to my superiors, my whole purpose was to find a way of establishing contact so that a senior U.S. official, and the names of those officials are in the memoranda that I sent to my superiors, could eventually have a meeting with senior Iranian officials, that it would be feasible politically for both sides to be able to do that. and the names of those officials are in the memoranda that I sent forward. The suggestion that the Vice President or the Secretary of State meet with senior Iranians for the purposes of ending that horrible conflict, which happens to be the largest war on the planet Earth right now, would be to the best interests of our country and both of theirs. We were in desperate need of a translator. As I have indicated earlier, there was no translator available within the CIA at that point that could provide those kinds of services. I did not speak Farsi. The Iranians with whom we were talking obviously spoke Farsi but not English.
So
and
it was for that.
I did not want to have to rely on the translations being provided by Mr. Ghorbanifar. And when I mentioned this to General Secord, my recollection is that he said, well, I will get Albert Hakim, who perhaps by then I knew the name, but in any event, Mr. Hakim came and served as translator for those meetings.
All right. And that was the meeting that you have testified to where the 7 points were first discussed with the first channel?
No, sir.
Or is that
my recollection
later?
is that the 7 points issue came up with the second channel somewhat later.
Now, at the time that you asked for Mr. Hakim at the suggestion of General Secord and met with the first channel, was in fact Mr. Hakim the only person on our side, you were handling the trip, that spoke Farsi?
Yes, he was. Well, General Secord speaks some Farsi. He served in Iran, and he does speak some. And I hope I'm not insulting him, but I don't think he speaks it as well as Mr. Hakim.
Did you stop to think at all, and I know that you sought approval from your superior, that the only person negotiating for the United States of America with Iran that ultimately obtained the agreement was a private citizen who had a substantial financial interest in the outcome of those negotiations?
I don't believe that I communicated that to Admiral Poindexter, no, sir.
And that never concerned Admiral Poindexter or yourself?
Well, and it may well be, Congressman Jenkins, that I was most injudicious, and I have certainly, difficult though it has been, and painful though some of it has been, told the committee of things that I have done. I quite honestly considered that to be motivation to make it succeed, in that he had interests that went beyond just his next promotion or going back and getting an accolade from his boss, that in fact it offered a greater chance for ultimate success. I knew as early as mid-October that my tenure at the NSC was coming to a close. I had had lengthy discussions about this with Director Casey. I had talked to Admiral Poindexter about it. I believe I'd even talked to Mr. McFarlane about it. And I stood there beside my safe, and I was pulling out things out of the safe and looking at them, and occasionally I'd drop one in the shredder, which was right next to my safe. As I recall, my secretary then walked over to me and said, "Why are you doing this? You know, you could be doing work on the chronology or doing work on something else. Let me help," or words to that effect. She then asked me, "What about the phone call logs and things that are yours personally?" And I said, "They probably ought to go." And it's my recollection that most of this stack of foot and a half, or however it's been described in earlier testimony, consisted of phone logs, things that I had been told during my tenure at the NSC staff were mine and mine alone, plus the prof's notes that I considered to be mine and mine alone, deeply personal communications between me and my colleagues, and in some cases my superiors. And I asked her to put those in the shredder, because those I considered to be mine. Not that they specifically related to this activity, but simply that they were not going to go anywhere and they ought to go in the shredder. And so what has been created is this sensational, horrible, final, last-minute, last-ditch shredding. And it wasn't that at all.
You'd already done that shredding.
I thought I had gotten it all. That's correct, Mr. Niels.
And the fact that you shredded a whole stack of documents in the afternoon of Friday, November 21st, right after you had heard the Attorney General's people were coming to look at documents in the morning, is a pure coincidence. It had nothing to do with the fact that the Attorney General's people were coming in over the weekend to look at documents. Is that your testimony?
The documents that they were going to look at were already laid out on the table in my office, and I am sure that there are colleagues of mine who worked in that office who can testify to that effect.
Sometime in mid-November of 1986, were you asked to prepare summaries of the United States government's involvement in arms sales to Iran?
My recollection, Mr. Niels, is that I was asked shortly after the revelations in al-Sharia, and then the subsequent pickup by that by the American media, to prepare a chronology of the facts. And my recollection is that the very first of those was prepared during a rather frantic period of time during the first week or so of November. And that my first effort at that was probably about the 7th of November. And it was simply an effort to factually recount what had happened. I think there are two things, if I may just explain something to you, to explain some of the bewilderment that you may see, not only in me, but perhaps other witnesses who worked at the NSC. We all sincerely believed that when we sent a prof's message to another party and punched the button delete, that it was gone forever. Wow, were we wrong. And you have before you now recollections of facts or collections of facts as they were communicated back and forth to one another, for example, in November of 1985 or December of 1985, that we did not have at our disposal in November of 1986.
Now you're saying that when you pushed the delete button on a prof message, you thought it was gone from the system forever.
That's correct.
Are you also saying that if it was gone from the system, that you could pretend it never happened?
That's not what I said.
During the month of November, you prepared a number of these chronologies.
During the month of November 1986.
1986.
That's correct.
And the committees have a number of these chronologies which we were given, which have been obtained from your office at the White House. The most recent, the final version, was done on November the 20th and is Exhibit 23 in your second book of exhibits.
Well, counsel gets that out. I would take issue with one word that you just said, counsel, and that is final version. I don't believe that prior to my departure a final version was ever done or completed.
Do you recall that on Monday morning, the 24th, the shredder was full and overflowing?
I don't remember that it was necessarily Monday, but I do remember that happened at some point, yes.
Do you remember shredding documents during the lunch hour on the 22nd when the representatives of the Attorney General's office had left for their lunch?
I remember shredding documents while they were in there reading documents.
You're shredding them in their presence?
Well, I mean, they were sitting in my office, and the shredder was right outside, and I walked out and shredded documents.
More than a few pieces of paper, right?
Pardon?
It would be more than a few pieces of paper.
Well, that's a pretty high-speed shredder. It eats them pretty quick. And I'm not trying to be light about it, but I mean, they were sitting in my office reading, and I'd finish a document and say, we don't need that anymore. I'd walk up and I'd go out and shred it. They could hear it. The shredder was right outside the door.
Well, I'm not trying to be light about it either, that you would go up there and take documents that they had finished reading?
No. I want to be very clear. They were sitting, I had my office, and you've now had a diagram of this palatial basement office on the 3rd floor of the old EOB. It was up on the wall here somewhere. And the desk that I had was in the corner of my office, and then there was a table about this size, and on that table was laid out all of the Iran documents. And I was working at my desk on other things, literally cleaning up files on lots of things. And when I'd finish with a handful of documents, I'd walk up, walk past them, walk out the door, you know where the shredder was, turn the corner, turn on the shredder, and drop them in.
Is it also so that for some months you had been telling friends like Mr. Owen that you were going to be the fall guy?
I may well have, as I believe I have already testified. I may well have told Mr. Owen and perhaps others that if this whole thing came down to creating a political controversy or embarrassment, and you remember again that Mr. Owen did not know, I don't believe, anything about the Iranian initiative, that I would be the person who would be dismissed or reassigned or fired or blamed or fingered or whatever one wants to use as a description, that I was willing to serve in that capacity. All of that assumed that this was not going to be a matter of criminal behavior, but rather one of deniability for the White House, the administration, or whatever, for political purposes. And when I say political purposes, I am speaking of not only domestic, but the international ramifications. That is one of the essences of plausible deniability in a covert operation.
Let me ask you about that, really. You are a very articulate person and persuasive. In looking back on this, do you think that sometimes you may have persuaded your superior to take certain action even when cabinet members were opposed, simply because of your eloquence and very sincere beliefs?
I have no doubt about that.
Many times.
I have indicated that I accept responsibility.
Yes, I understand that. That's not a bad trait. It's a good trait, that you were able to persuade people. Isn't that correct?
The good Lord gives us all certain gifts.
And you certainly have a good one there that you should be very grateful for.
I don't know. I only know that that's why I have said repeatedly that I want to find out, I want to get to the bottom of this and find out all that has happened. And so far, I've told you all that I know, and you know the truth of the matter is, for quite some long time, all that you knew is what I'd told you. All I know is that I was never, my memory didn't fail me on the fact that I had agreed to this thing. The only thing I could not recall was at what point was I asked. And as a result of that, and not being able to recall when,